Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Week Ahead, a podcast by SBM Intelligence. I'm your host, Pisol and every Saturday we look at some stories shaping our continent. First up, we consider Nigeria's debt burden, which has ballooned to a staggering 121 trillion naira, raising concerns about the country's ability to service its loans and invest in vital areas. We'll explore the causes and potential consequences of this mounting burden. Next, we'll look at a potential source of conflict in West Africa. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger which have left ECOWAS and formed the alliance of Sahelian States. We explore the broader implications of this move for regional stability. Finally, is climate change dealing with Nigeria? Heavy rains have caused flooding across several states, displacing residents and disrupting businesses. The government warns that even more areas could be impacted, raising fears of a wider crisis. We'll discuss the government's response and the long-term challenges posed by extreme weather events. Joining me for insights on these critical stories is Samuel Atiku, a public policy analyst. Welcome to the show, Samuel.
Thank you for having me on the program.
Yeah. All right. So on our first story, basically we heard that Nigeria's debt has ballooned to 121 trillion naira. So apparently this is a 19% increase from 97 trillion naira as of December 2023. So this shift happened within 3 months. So can you tell us what were the main drivers of this sharp rise? What happened? What are the key factors that contributed to this increase?
I think the combination of, I'll call it actions of government in the last 10 years. One, Nigeria has not been growing its revenue the way it should have been growing it, but it has been spending heavily. I recall, if you remember, when the last administration came in 2015 now. Yeah, when they got in 2015, the economy was already tanking. Yeah, there was a global challenge with crude oil. And of course, the outgoing government then actually did introduce and said they were going to have austerity. But when the new government came in, they felt that they were following another path, which is going to be expansionary. They are going to spend heavily. They were going to ride Nigeria out of recession. So what they essentially did was to begin to borrow heavily and then spend massively. And in anticipation that the more you inject cash into the economy will pick up and then things will begin to roll over. And unfortunately, I think where the decisions they make in terms of where they were spending, what they were spending on, there are big question mark around that. But ultimately, fasting forward now, 2019, we had accumulated massive amount of debt, and then we're struggling to actually mobilize revenue. Just for context, the total revenue of government then, in 2015, the total spending of government before the outgone administration actually increased it, used to be in the region, the threshold of about 4.5 trillion, 5 trillion. By the time they were leaving in 2019, the budget was already north of about 12 trillion, meaning that they've more than tripled or even, tripled the budget itself. But unfortunately, the revenue of government, which used to be around 3.5 trillion, did not significantly grow, meaning that you have to close the loop with other things. And they started the aggressive borrowing. They were borrowing, and then they were also borrowing from the central bank, which is what we call ways and means. So what you see now is a accumulation of those actions that were taken in the past. And then the new government got in also, and then they continue in that trajectory. And that explains, I think that's the fundamental pillar. I mean, explaining to everybody that's the real issue. Where we spend. Now, for government to spend, it's not out of place. But as long as you're spending on things that will, one way or the other, boost up the economy and ensure that you are mobilizing enough resources, you are mobilizing enough taxation, you're collecting tax from people, you are making a lot of money to augment that. But that have not been the case in Nigeria. So unfortunately, this is where we find ourselves, where in fact, the whole crude oil, the whole money that the federal government is making from crude oil cannot even service its debt. That's the peculiar. That's the stage we find ourselves today. So it's quite unfortunate that's happened in the past. Unfortunately, again, I keep saying unfortunately, I don't think we've learned from the past and then we're taking corrective measures.
All right. So I heard that part of what contributed to the sharp rise and increase is the securitization of the ways and means, and then the use of a new exchange rate. So aside from borrowing, do you think that those factors still have contributed to the rise in debt?
Yes, I think it's much of the same thing. Ways and means are actually borrowings from the central bank. Remember, the central bank itself can literally print money, whether electronic computer or you print cash, right? Those money are called high-powered money. So when the federal government goes to the central bank and they borrow, essentially, it's not backed by any productive output. So let me explain it this way. If you go to the economy, the broader economy, you come to Ade, you come to Jide, you go to Shukudi, you go to this one, you borrow money from them. They are drawing the money from their savings and they are giving it to you. So the money is leaving the economy and you are handing it over to someone, and then the government spend it back into the economy. That's the usual channel through which government borrows. And that's why you see them issuing bonds, borrowing directly from banks through treasury bills and short-term lending. But sometimes the federal government also borrow directly from the central bank, which we call ways and means. Now, when they do that, it comes at a high cost, meaning that you have to service, they have to on those debts. Now, the money out of to you and then you go spend it. Of course, the implication of that is that you have larger inflation and all those things. But that said, what the central bank did, what the central bank and the federal government did when the last outgoing government was there was to take this money and transform it into a bond. Rather than call it ways and means, just change the nomenclature and call it ways. Instead of calling it ways and means, which is a loose canon, it's just like you going to a bank and drawing overdraft. Rather than call it overdraft, let's even call it loan. So that's what they did. And then the central bank itself can decide to begin to sell those loans into the market, sell it to banks through through open market operations to actually equalize the economy. So that's essentially what happened. So it's still the borrowing, just that the securitization essentially means that they now push that on board. Now, for clarity, it's important to clarify this. When we say the federal government debt, what we are saying essentially is securitized debt. It doesn't mean, so if the federal government goes to a bank and borrow money, as long as that loan is not securitized, it's not counted as part of the debt of the federal government. So that, and we knew in 2019, 2020, 2021, that the debt of government is already too huge. But the definition, that color derivation that we call it, that because it's not securitized, it makes it look as if the debt is small. But now that they've securitized it, it now makes it a little bit larger. So yes, in terms of conceptual definition of public debt, yes, things had gone up because they've securitized it. But the underlying reasons why we have this huge debt has to do with aggressive expansionary fiscal policy, or what you call spending money without making money. Essentially, that's what caused it.
Yeah, so, according to the central bank, the government spent, let's say, approximately $16 billion on debt servicing between 2019 and 2024. How sustainable is this level of debt servicing for Nigeria? Considering that our foreign reserves are depleting and we are not so strong on production.
Yes, it's not sustainable. You cannot continue. You cannot continue to borrow money, right? You cannot continue to borrow money without having a way to actually pay back that debt. But the truth is that it's government are allowed to go a lot. You can navigate through all these things through different channels. And one of those channels is what you have seen happening in terms of how you devalue the currency. Now, I will say that my own presumption and the way I think about, the way I actually try to think about this is simple. If your entire oil revenue, the money you are making from crude oil sales, the whole royalty on crude oil cannot service your debt, you have a big question to ask yourself. So essentially, if your entire money from resources that you're pulling out of the ground cannot service your debt, I think it's time to take a pause to actually reflect on what you are doing. That's one. Number two, it's also important to mention that even the value added tax that people fixate around is still strongly coupled with ability of Nigeria to import goods. If you look at the VAT component, right? A big chunk of that VAT component comes from one, importation, when people are importing goods into the country, and number two, when government itself spend on infrastructure project or maybe they are procuring things. That makes up a substantial amount of how much we gain from VAT. Meaning that if we don't get money, if we are not making enough money from crude, we're not making enough tax money to spend. One way or the other, it is going to affect the VAT component of the revenue. Company's profitability. When we say CIT, company income tax itself, it's also reliant and heavily dependent on the ability of businesses in Nigeria to be profitable. Now, for businesses to be profitable, one of the big business that we have, apart from the financial services, is to look at Nigeria's industries itself. They depend heavily on the importation, right, of raw material, as they depend heavily on the importation of spare parts and all those kind of things. If they can't access some of those things or they become too expensive, definitely it's going to affect their profitability, and it means that the CIT component will also take a tank. Remember, the last component of government revenue happens to be import, right? When we import goods into the country, we charge tariffs, we charge levies, we come up with excise, and when we export, we do some excise duties. That component of custom revenue also depends on your ability to get in dollars from crude oil sales and then import goods into the country, given the peculiar nature that we find the economy. Now, my take here is simple. If the federal government, despite its securitization, despite its managing of the exchange rate, reducing it to make it more naira more available vis-a-vis dollars, but we are still struggling to get the dollars. The entire structure of the economy itself, in terms of revenue, it's under significant headwind. And the only pathway for you as government is to think deep about you need to look deeper at the challenges you're facing in front of you and take corrective measure. Unfortunately, I've not seen actions be taken to address this problem. And that's why I worry that continue to pile up more debt is not going to solve the problem. We're only pushing the problem backwards. Somebody will have to address the big elephant in the room. And I hope that we start addressing it today so that the children that we give birth to will not be the one to pay for the mistakes that we have made as when we are young, we should have actually taken corrective measures. I think that's what I would say.
Yeah, I'm glad that you touched on profitability and oil, because recently we heard that the NNPC owes international traders about $6 billion for imported petrol. And is that the NNPC is also considering securing a $2 billion loan using crude oil prepayments. What do you have to say on that? I mean, how will this strategy, this loan, impact NNPC's operations, considering Nigeria's overall debt profile?
Yeah, so looking at the Nigerian overall debt profile, it's important to mention that when we say public debt, we don't add a lot of debts. There are a lot of debts that are hanging in there, and you just touch based on one of them, which is the debt that NNPC owe, whether in terms of its JV operations, they still have outstanding debt on that, whether it has to do with importation of PMS and then what have you. There are also other agencies of government that do hold external parties or even internal parties debts that have not been captured. The big implication is simple, and it's not far-fetched. NNPC, under the PIB concept, because they are allowed one way or the other, I know there are still governance issues around the operations of NNPC, but because they are allowed to operate as an independent entity, essentially in quote and unquote, please, I know in terms of operationalization of that, there are still big question mark around whether they are operating independently. I think the big question is that I know, yes, you need those resources to be able to put one or two things together. And if you are taking in $6 billion and you are using it to pull up and build up maybe new pipeline strings, maybe NNPC is taking those debts to actually construct a line from Nigeria all the way to Europe to actually plug into the gas ecosystem in the European Union so that we can export more goods in there, then I would say, oh, there's no problem. But we're spending this thing on consumptions. We're borrowing money and then we're spending it to fuel our cars today. And those debts are remaining there. So how do we pay those debts? Of course, that's concerning. And that's again another, I'll call it misplaced priority that we're doing. And we're taking misplaced priority. The long-term implication is simple. NNPC ability to borrow, to invest in critical infrastructure, gas infrastructure, oil and gas infrastructure will be diminished if we continue on this trajectory. One way or the other, somebody have to pay it. And we all know that this debt is going to be pushed, whether we like it on the federation, it's going to go into the federation account. And then, of course, we have continuous ballooning debt. And the unfortunate truth is that we don't have infrastructure in Nigeria to say, okay, this is what the debt has been used to do. And as such, it's going to boost up the economy and we can begin to repay it back. I think that's the biggest concern for me on that.
All right. So speaking of revenue generation, what strategies can governments consider to improve revenue streams? Because obviously we are in desperate need of that. Are there particular sectors or reforms that could significantly boost Nigeria's revenue?
Yes, I've been running a series of research around how developing countries can mobilize domestic resources. And there are big question mark, and then comparing vis-a-vis to the developed countries. In Nigeria, for instance, 65%, if not 70% of business activity are happening informally, meaning that most businesses are operating under the cover of, operating under the cover of sole proprietorship, or they are operating informally, meaning that they are not registered for tax purposes, essentially meaning that we're losing a lot of revenue as a country. Why businesses keep making money? I think the big question is that to ask ourselves, I think there are four broad issues here. I think there's a behavioral component to it that we need to address. Number two, I think the whole tax ecosystem of Nigeria is too convoluted and then confusing. You have a lot of tax laws flying here and there, and there's no clarity. I think that's the second thing to think about. I think the third one is the rational theory itself. I mean, people talk about rationality itself. People think if you do one-on-one together, it will give you two. It doesn't work like that in real practice. And then finally, I think also in terms of what we call the tax morale of people. When people see your tax money doing certain things, it encourages you to pay. But unfortunately, we don't seem to have that in Nigeria. Give or take, I think there are two things here. The first thing is to think about it. Nigeria corporate tax is one way or the other ridiculously too high. See, as a person, I will just give you that. As a person, myself, if I'm operating a business as an individual, there are high chances that my tax rate will be less than 20%. And if I'm in a state that is not efficient in how they collect their tax, I can even manipulate that and pay even less than 10%. But unfortunately, if you're operating as a business and you register for business purpose, your company income tax is simple. You have to pay roughly about 30% of your profits. In the world, that's one of the highest tax rates in the world, meaning that it makes absolutely no sense for you as a small, or you that you're aspiring to set up business, to think of Nigeria as a tax haven. No, even the UK that people complain about, their corporate tax rate is way lower than Nigeria. We need to ask ourselves those hard questions. I think that's the first starting point. The second one is the value-added tax. Most of the transactions in Nigeria are actually unreceipted. And what I mean in essence is that if I go and purchase something or I pay for a service, we have a culture of not asking for receipts. So if I walk into a business and I ask for receipt, I look at the receipt and the receipt tells me that, oh, you've deducted 7% or 5% or 10% of my tax as VAT. I should be able to go on a system to actually type in the code to confirm whether this person had actually remitted the money. And if the person have not, there should be an incentive for me to report. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in Nigeria. We've suggested to government that you need to incentivize the need for people to, one, collect receipts, and number two, to actually plug that receipt into a database to confirm whether the business owner that have actually done the transaction had remitted that VAT to the person. Now, how do you incentivize this? There are countries in the world that have used systems of lottery. Maybe on every receipt that you purchase something of maybe 1,000 naira or above 1,000 naira, you go on a system, you simply press the receipt number there, you type the total number of transaction that you've done in there, you even scan up the receipt. That goes into the federal government or the FIRS database for audit purposes. And then based on that, they generate a code for you that you can use for a lottery, right? And then with that lottery, maybe you can win something like 1 million, more like an incentive for you to jump into that room. We need to creatively and innovatively find a way to create audit trail for transactions happening in Nigeria, and how the Federal Inland Revenue Service can use those audit trail to actually begin to punish those that are actually not remitting tax. I mean, that's just one of those ideas. I think we've had series, I think I've shared about close to about 25 different scenarios, collecting information from across the world on how things are being done. We need to begin to implement some of this on transactions. I think the third one has to do with the company income tax. Your businesses must be profitable. The situation whereby you have oceans, you have trailers. For instance, now if you want to move maize from the port in Nigeria down to your factory, say in Apapa, the money, the miscreants that you have on the roads will make that business operation not profitable. That's the truth. I mean, we can't continue to deceive ourselves as a country. We allow certain things to happen, and that's affecting business operation. My take is that it is not out of place for the federal government to declare the highway a very important infrastructure that cannot be hijacked, meaning that you can't have all these roadblocks that even the police contributes to, all these unnecessary roadblocks on the way that inhibit and make it difficult for the logistics of business to run in the country. What powers every economy in the world is the logistics. In fact, if you look at the US economy, roughly about 9 to 10% of the economy is waved around their logistics system. Now in Nigeria, the logistics system in Nigeria is a big issue. I know we have the railway coming up. We have this thing coming up now, but you can't have those problems on the way, those bottlenecks on the way, and you don't have a problem. We need to take those things out, and those things are easily done. Those are little low-hanging fruits that we can quickly put in place to make Nigerian business a little bit, at least give them some cushion. Then the unnecessary high tax rate needs to be brought down. And then with that, we can now expand the tax net, right? We can ensure that more people are paying. Then the seamlessness of how you pay also, the thinking behind the process of paying those taxes, how you calculate your tax, needs to be synthesized and make it easy. We have technology today that can help us do some of those things. So I'm expecting that those are the simple, low-hanging fruits that government can put in place quickly to begin to draw in funds. I mean, if you look at the GDP number, if you look at the GDP by expenditure number, it is clear there. You see operating surplus. It's one of the highest in the world, meaning that businesses are making a kill. People that are operating businesses in Nigeria are making huge money, and they are walking out of that economy, walking out of Nigeria economy without actually paying their fair share into the economy. And we need to stop that. Fortunately, it is the poor, the working poor, and the have-nots, the ones that are easy to hold their neck, right, that you see that government cloth their neck. It is the downfall drivers, the Keke Marwa, or what do you call it now, the Keke Napep driver, that government owe them and then they drag them all through their feet. Those are the ones that are forced to pay tax, and most of those taxes are not even remitted, to be candid with you. So there are a lot of work to do around our tax ecosystem. The unfortunate truth is that I don't think the direction of travel is anywhere healthy, and we're heading the right direction.
All right. Thank you. Let's move to the next story, which is about Niger and Benin. So basically, we heard this week that Niger Junta has agreed to talks with Benin to restore relations. So I want to ask, what were the events that led to the border closure with Benin, this conflict?
I think the closure itself waves around the coup d'etats and then the influence of Russia within Sub-Saharan Africa. And then also, I think the overbearing nature of dictators. Sometimes dictators make irrational decisions without looking at economic implication of what they're doing. Personally, I think when you look closely at ECOWAS, there are some weak points that we can always dwell on. But ECOWAS had been there for decades, and the reason why we've not had this kind of incident is simple, is because one way or the other, everybody tend to see benefit within the economic structure of West Africa, right? You could move goods around, you could travel around freely, it makes it easier for goods to come into the country. For instance, beans from Burkina Faso, some goods from Niger into Nigeria, and all those kind of things. I mean, the economic fluency of West Africa. In fact, if you look closely at the movement of goods and all those things, it makes it easier for some of these countries to do this. But when you think of it, of course, there were coup d'etats in some of those countries. West Africa took a hard line. And then because of that, the influence of Russia in the world, and then the world is changing rapidly. They came in there and they felt, oh, we could steer things in different direction. And then people feel emboldened also to do certain things. And then we had where where we are now. So my take here is simple. And the countries that seems to have pulled out of West Africa, one, they did not take their time to look at the economic implication of what they are doing, because they really do not care. They are more interested in the political harm of things. They want to see themselves as being independent. But these are landlocked countries, for crying out loud. They are landlocked countries. The economy of those countries, again, there are issues with statistics here. But my presumption and my perception is that, and thinking through what has happened in the past, is to say that the economy of those countries are worst off. Whether we like it or not. Now, the flip side of things also from the ECOWAS center also, you're shrinking as an economic community. Meaning that you have a smaller market. Of course, Nigeria tends to dominate most of the market. If you take Nigeria and Ghana, they become one of the biggest center in there. But when you look at those other countries and then you look at it in terms of population perspective and you look at it in terms of potential, it seems to be shrinking. Which is not healthy for the community, for ECOWAS itself. In between this also, I think because ECOWAS itself has slowed down many significant issues. For instance, we've always had this conversation about having a common currency to make sure to facilitate trade among West Africa. That's not happened. We saw a situation whereby Nigeria at some point in time in 2020 actually closed their border with ECOWAS, which is weird because that should not be if you look at the arrangement itself. So a lot of countries seem to have flaunted these rules, and then this country felt, well, it doesn't really matter, we just exist on paper. And that's where we are going in terms of direction of travel. I think it's important for us to go back to the basis and begin to fix what ECOWAS was actually set up for. Yeah, thank you.
All right. So, but how the international actors like China, I know you mentioned Russia earlier, how have they contributed to the situation that's playing out between ECOWAS and the three countries, Niger, Benin, and Burkina Faso, that have decided to form the Alliance of Sahel States? So what roles have they played in this pullout?
Yes. So the first thing is the military sense. So I keep mentioning that it's political, right? Russia want to be seen as having its own, well, in quotes, the new colonies of Russia in Africa. Well, so essentially, when the issue happened, they quickly backed up this country. And most of these countries are Francophone countries, And so, France do not have good, to be sincere, France do not necessarily have a good standing in sub-Saharan Africa because of their antecedents. And so they felt that they are couching themselves out of the old colonial influence of France. That's the way they portray to the people. And so people felt liberated. So again, it's political. It has nothing to do with economy. It's not that because of what they are doing, Russia is now shipping them crude oil. They can now fly in things there. Things are not going in there. If you go there, China is not building infrastructure in those countries. No, absolutely not. I don't think China is even more interested in what's happening in there. So it's more political, just like I said earlier. These are political way of actually stemming your authority in the world to say, okay, we have more influence. We go into your territory because you are giving us problem. We go into your territories. We actually you so it's more back. We are back to 1914, 1919, 1914 that built up to 1945.
Yeah, that's really sad. And I think what's something else that is really sad is going to be our third story, which is about the current flooding crisis in Nigeria. So the federal government said that no fewer than 10 states and of course Abuja experienced various floods in July. So presently, there's a prediction that like 148 local governments will also experience flooding very soon. So what exactly is causing this flooding across different states? Even in Lagos, a building fell in Mushin, people were grounded. I was seeing many videos on social media, really, really sad stuff. So what are the factors causing this flooding right now?
I think there are lots of problems hanging in. I mean, that's creating some of these big challenges, and it's becoming an annual ritual now for the flood lines of Nigeria to be flooded. And the truth is that the rivers, right? Uh, Population is expanding, and as population expand, whether we like it or not, we begin to live in very, very precarious and very, very terrible places that ideally people have not been living before. And people go closer and closer to the wetlands, or what I call the floodplains of Nigeria. Now, what I'm far more interested in is what government is doing to remedy some of those challenges. Now, the critical cause of it, people always come up with different stories. They tell you about the dam in Cameroon being opened, the significant rainfall. Those are things you as a government cannot control. But what can you control is actually to have critical infrastructure. I start with Lagos. Lagos have a drainage master plan. And the drainage master plan was set up years before. I remember in 2018, we had a lab where we were looking at the drainage master plan. And we're looking at whether it's still appropriate to address the peculiar challenges Lagos is facing and look at the cost implication and look at how much the state government had invested in it. I think with a report foundation. And there were gaps, significant gaps. In fact, the state government is not even committing up to 10% of how much they promised to fix those drainage master plan. That is one. Two, when you look at Nigeria closely, during the dry season, things get extremely very dry. So there's no water captive system for capturing water and storing them for maybe for agricultural use in future. Nobody's tending to think of those infrastructure. That's not even in the legislative term of how policymakers think about this. You cannot go to the National Assembly and see them come up with creative ideas to address some of these issues. Policy discourse seems to be, I'll call it, thrown everywhere. And that's where the problem lies. See, there are some lowland areas across the country that can be used as a water captive. I mean, you could use to capture some of this water. And when you capture some of this water, it could potentially even generate electricity for you. If you look closely at the US with their water captive dams that they've had there, a way of actually solving two problems with one, but it involves you investing in critical infrastructure, right? That is number two. Number three, in terms of the people at the receiving end of things, most times than none, it is the working poor and the have-nots. And government seems, again, I keep saying the word seems, not to prioritize their needs. Government focus their attention on certain frivolous things that are of no essence to people, like building the vice president's house, than solving the problem that affect this group of people. So when you put them together, I think the political economy of things tells us the direction of travel. And the direction of travel is simple. This problem is not a priority for government. If it's a priority for government, those solutions would have come in handy. My take is simple here that the challenge we have with flooding, one way or the other, rests solely on government. Whether we live in a country where we like it or not, the rain will fall, there will be water, our river will overflood its banks. The dam in Cameroon will be open if that's the situation. Many things will happen. Dams will be open, water will flow out. But the real question is that what has government done to ensure that communities and people sitting around that plane are actually cordoned off and ensure that they are safe or they are moved away? The truth is that they've done nothing. And that's what we need to anchor on.
All right. I'm glad that you zeroed in on the human-induced causes of the flooding. But how has climate change generally impacted the rising tide and the increase in rainfall and flooding in Nigeria?
Yes, climate change it's a big question. Yeah, it's big. Yeah, that's one of the fundamental reasons why we have some of these things happening. Whether we like it or not, the sea levels will continue to go up, and because of melting of ice, and then the water level in the ocean is going up. I think that's documented, that's factual, no matter how people try to paint it and call it wokeism or give it one coloration to make it, when you have fact, when you present somebody with facts and the person is trying to deviate, they come up with this code word calling people leftists for making society better. That's the truth. The second thing there is that the Sahara Desert, the earth plane itself within the desert seems to be encroaching. If you look at the Lake Chad Basin, it's almost gone. So while we have more water down south in Nigeria, we're having it hotter there in the north, up north, meaning that the desert seems to be heating up on our arable lands. And the fundamental reason for this has to do with number one, pollution. Number two, a whole lot of things create these issues, and then people seem to keep documenting it. I mean, academias, people that have no interest in the game have documented some of the factors that they've seen contributing to this thing. So for Nigeria, what is the pathway for us? I think the pathway for us is for us to begin to become a voice. Because the economic capital of Nigeria is Lagos, and Lagos is under threat. In fact, people are projecting that within 50 years, the whole of Lagos will be underwater. So how do we prevent Lagos, which is the economic nerve center of Nigeria, from going underwater? Is to continue to make sure that the developed world are held accountable. And how do you hold the developed countries accountable? Is for you yourself to begin to address some of the peculiar issues that are creating those issues. I mean, that are creating those changes. One, we keep flaring up gases. We invest in green infrastructure. We need to begin to invest in forests. We need to reforest ourselves. For instance, if you go to Calabar now, the last government was all on hell bent on actually tearing down the forest and taking it down and making sure it becomes useless. We need to begin to rehash. We need to rehash the Lake Chad Basin to make sure. So a whole lot of things needs to happen for us to address these challenges.
All right. Thank you so much, Samuel, for participating in today's episode. It was a rich one. And to all our listeners, this podcast is by SBM Intelligence. For deeper insights into our work, please visit our website at sbmintel.com and remember to connect with us on social media. You can find us on X, Facebook, and LinkedIn at SBM Intelligence. So that's all the time we have today. Thanks for joining us. We'll meet again next week. Bye.